In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some creative ways to duplicate objects. Alright, so we've talked about how to duplicate objects in a couple of different ways. We know that we can clone objects by selecting them and holding Shift and moving them. That will create a clone. And we've also seen how we can grab an object and use the array tool to make duplications. And we can also even select an object and just hit Control V to make a duplication right where it's at, okay, to clone that object. But now I want to talk about how to duplicate objects along a specific path. So let's say that we have these pipes here and they're just kind of floating in the air. And what we want to do is we want to create a set of these pipe supports that will basically duplicate along the path of the piping. Well, we've already created the path for this pipe, so we've already done most of the work here. Now, once you have your model finished of the pipe support, you could go ahead and use what's called snapshot with a combination of the path constraint to create a specific and creative duplication here. So to get started with this, a couple of things that I want to point out whenever using this method for duplication is that you want to make sure that your pivot point of your object that you're duplicating is in the correct place. So I will have my object right up against the wall where I want it to be, and you'll see that it's intersecting with the path here. However, my pivot point is not in the same position as my path, and what's going to happen is if I were to use this path constraint, it's going to snap this object's pivot point, or snap the object to this line at the pivot point. So it's going to move it off to the left here and up a little bit and then duplicate it around. So what we need to do is we need to set up our pivot point. So let's go to our left view by hitting L on the keyboard, and then I'm going to hit F3. So I need my pivot point to be right about here. So let's hit Effect Pivot Only, and with our Move tool, let's just move this pivot point to pretty much right on top of that line. Okay, so you can see that orange line there, and that's pretty close. So we'll go ahead and we'll turn off Effect Pivot Only, and then we'll hit F3 back up a little bit, and we can see that our pivot point is pretty much right on that line. So with this object selected, let's go ahead and go to Animation, Constraints, and then Path Constraint. What this is going to do is snap this object to a path that we select. So you can see that we get this little dotted line or rubber band, and it's waiting for us to pick a line. So let's pick line 003. And you'll see that it snaps to the beginning of that line there. Now watch what happens here. If I go ahead and I move my time slider, you'll notice that that pipe support begins to move across that line. Now a couple of things that you'll want to pay attention to whenever you are using this method is you want to make sure that it's going to duplicate across the path in the way that you want. So watch as we get around this curve. It comes up to the curve, but it stays exactly in the same position as it was before. So it's facing down that Y direction always. And what we want it to do is we want it to kind of bank and curve out as it comes around this curve. And then once we get on this wall, you'll see that it's turned completely the wrong way. We want it to face out in the negative X direction. So let's go back to 0 on our time slider. I'm going to hit Z to frame on that object. And I'm going to go to my animation or my motion panel here, and you'll see that we have path constraint in our constraints position list here. With this selected here, we can go down into our path parameters, and you'll see that we have this follow. Go ahead and check that, and then what we'll do is we'll take this down to around 50 frames. We'll hit Z, and you'll see that this is getting down next to that curve. And once it gets to the curve, you'll notice how it turns into the proper direction. So we've oriented that to work properly. So we know that this is going to work right. Now you'll notice that it's not duplicating. It's just moving this object down across this line here. And that's going to pose as a problem to us. So what we are going to use is the snapshot tool to actually duplicate this object across that path. So let's go to Tools, Snapshot, and then here we can tell it how to snap. So we could do a single frame, and what it will do is create a copy on whatever frame we're on. Okay, so let's say that I want to make a single copy at 30. I could do snapshot on that frame, and it will make a copy right there. Now I don't want to do that. I want to actually use a range. So let's hit cancel. Let's go back to 0. Let's go to Tools, Snapshot, and then Range, and we're going to do from 0, frame 0, to frame 100. I'm going to tell it how many copies to make, and in this case I want it to be 16 copies. Okay, so we're also going to have our clone method, so we can make a copy of it, or we could make a mesh out of all of these different objects. And I want them to be separate meshes, so I'm going to set this to mesh and then hit OK. Now you'll see that it creates those copies all the way around our path, and now we have these pipe supports that we can now use. Now if you don't like the number of pipe supports there, you can always hit Control Z and then retry that snapshot. So we could set it up to something like 12, and you'll see that that spaces out a little bit more. All right, so now that we have this, there might be a couple of things that we'll have to set up. First off, take a look at the supports and where they're positioned on the walls. So it looks like this is positioned pretty well on that wall, just kind of going through there. But right here, you'll see that that pipe support isn't on that wall, so we'll have to make some changes to that. So let's go to Edge Mode, and I'm going to select this edge, hold Shift, and select this one. So it selects that entire ring, and then we'll use Connect, and I'll do 2 segments, set that to 0, and we'll pinch that to about 12, and then I'm going to hit OK. Grab this polygon right here, and then I'm just going to pull that straight out. And that's going to give me a little bit of a curve there, and my pipe won't be going through there any longer. But now it looks like it's right up against that wall. Alright, great. So now that we have this, we have gone through a lot of different techniques for creating environmental objects. We've talked about different types of duplication. We've talked about how to create things like wires and hoses. We've talked about a lot of different modeling tips and techniques for box modeling without smoothing, box modeling with smoothing. And now in our next lesson, we're going to finish up by talking about set dressing and some of those different concepts for creating and finishing an environment. All right, so I'll see you then.